It says it's streaming. Yep, it looks live to me. All right. Welcome everyone to Indigenous Peoples Week at Humboldt State University. I'm very, very excited to be presenting here this speaker who was able to join us. If you are in the attendees list, if any person can just confirm for me that you can hear us, that we're broadcasting to you all, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it. All right, thank you. I see how, okay, all right, good. So it is Indigenous Peoples Week at Humboldt State University. On Monday, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day. And I did get a text message from someone who said, oh, is it like officially Indigenous Peoples Week now? And I was like, no, but at Humboldt State, we're extra. And we just like to have a whole week of Indigenous celebrations. And I'm so honored to bring Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico here to talk with you all. And I'm going to read you her bio, but I do want to let everybody know that I have been fortunate enough to know Dr. Spears-Rico for so many years. We were both at Stanford together. I'm not going to tell you when, because it's none of your business how old we are, but and I was able to know her as like when we were baby undergraduates, kind of thinking about the world that we were going to build and the things we were going to do and the ways we were going to just represent Indigenous women in different like places. And I'm so honored that she said yes to coming to speak and that she's here with us today. And I want to thank El Centro, who's our co-host on this, for helping us to fund bringing her here. And I just want everybody to really know that it's such an amazing thing to watch somebody that you knew kind of really come into their own, and then to see like the ways you saw them as just like beautiful people and poets when you were growing up, and now other people are like, you know her? And I'm like, oh, I know her. So I'm so very lucky that she's been in my life since I was just a young person, right? And thinking I didn't know what I was gonna do in life, and now here we both are. So to introduce her, Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico is Perinda Perpetua Indigenous Feminist poet and scholar who serves as an assistant professor of Chicano Latino Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Dr. Spears-Rico is also a poet and performance artist. She mothers a fierce Ojibwe-Wakana Decohikana named Miss Cozy and lives in St. Paul, Minnesota with her family. And even though I haven't met her daughter in person, I feel like I know her so well, and I get so excited about all the things that she's doing. So I want to welcome Dr. Spears-Rico. She's going to be able to speak with you today. And if you have questions, I encourage you to include them in the Q&A. We can go over them at the end of the discussion and review them with her. So thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon over here from Minnesota. I want to thank Dr. Baldi, who, as was mentioned, I've known a very long time since we were undergrads at Stanford, for this generous invitation to be part of Indigenous Peoples Week at CSU Humboldt. I also want to thank Native American Studies at Humboldt and El Centro for co-sponsoring this talk and inviting me. Today, I'm joining you from stolen Dakota land here on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. I live in St. Paul and I work in Minneapolis, and I'm going to be sharing with you a talk that I am beginning to develop that's going to turn into an article, hopefully, on the deconstruction of La Raza Cósmica. And I've been thinking about this a great deal because of Indigenous Peoples Day, which was Monday as it approached, and also because of all of the unrest that we had here in the Twin Cities, which was ground zero after the unjust killing of George Floyd happened on Memorial Day. After that happened, it built momentum for numerous movements that joined together here in the Twin Cities. One of them, which my family has been involved in through First Nations United, which is an organization that sometimes collaborates with AIM here in the Twin Cities with the American Indian movement. And I was there, as well as my brothers-in-law, some of my family members, when the Columbus statue was brought down in June. So I've been thinking a great deal about Columbus's legacy, you know, after witnessing that powerful takedown of the statue, and also, you know, witnessing it within my own body as an embodied experience and my own memories, everything that it brought up for me growing up and being raised by my grandparents in Michoacan. And those early memories of, you know, what they taught me about indigeneity. Much of what they taught me was ontological. It was just being immersed in the actual world, you know, that we lived in. My grandfather, Jose, Tata Jose, he was a milpero. He grew the three sisters in his milpa farm. And he was also a pulquero. He fermented pulque from maguey plants. And, you know, being exposed very early on, you know, to his daily life as a campesino, as a farmer, as, you know, somebody who, you know, remembered nothing but learning, you know, those ontologies, those ways of life, and sharing that with me in my early childhood was very formative. And my grandmother, Nana Senorina Rico, was a medicine person, and she assisted people mostly with spiritual ailments, and also, you know, prayed for their causes and for their illnesses, and you know, was appreciated in the community for those matters and for that labor. And so just thinking about, you know, what was my first classroom growing up and how did I learn, you know, to be Indigenous, that's definitely come to mind. And that all of that, you know, came to my mind as I witnessed the Columbus statue on the ground, facing, you know, face down on the ground when it came down in St. Paul. So I've been thinking about that. This also, you know, what it means as it meets Latinidad. There's been a great deal of conversations in the last, you know, in the last 10 years, you know, even before that, that Indigenous scholars have tried to bring forward to Latinidad, but that haven't necessarily been met with a great amount of openness to you know, what could become a very fecund debate to move us forward. And for example, one of my fields, which is Chicano Latino studies. So that's, I'm sharing, you know, this with you all to kind of, you know, foreground what my talk is going to be about and where I'm headed with my thinking about it. My talk is titled, Los Hijxs de la Malinche, Decolonizing la Raza Through an Indigenous Feminist Lens. This lecture deconstructs Latinidad by querying Mexican, Latin American origin myths and nationalist constructs through Chicana and Indigenous feminist interventions. October 12th is known as El Día de la Raza, or the day that la raza, the race, was born in Latin America. It is important to have a critical conversation about the origins of la raza as we think about Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day and Indigenous Peoples Week. What does it mean to uncritically embrace mestizaje 520 years after discovery? How can we reframe Latinidad through a critique of the gendered colonialist and nationalist violence, which produced the term la raza? In this talk, I will unpack la raza and critique malinchismo while taking you through a historical and intellectual trajectory of the term's origins, proponents of the term, and also its discontents, so that you can decide for yourself whether it's time to rethink Latinidad and mestizaje and on what terms that should take place. I will end by sharing how I'm celebrating this Indigenous Peoples Day, the stories and remembrances I engage in every day, the resilience and strength of Mexican Indigenous women fighting for autonomy and land rights. We are las hijas de la Malinche, and the new generation of abuelas, nanaqueris, women, young women, and girls countering colonialist stereotypes that uphold nationalist myths. We are deconstructing nationalisms while working towards autonomy and building the matriarchy that will save us all in the end. So to begin with a little bit of history to foreground the talk on Malinche. Malinche was born royal, we know that much. She was the daughter of a Nahua cacique from the Gulf Coast. She was an educated, you know, she was an educated young woman because she was the daughter of a cacique, but she was also living in what was an increasingly patriarchal world. What we know at this point in time in Mesoamerica in 1521, when Cortés first landed on the Gulf Coast, is that there was this turn to patriarchy in societies that had actually been very, very matriarchal in nature. And Malinche was witnessing that shift and was also a product of that shift. We know that she was traded. I'm not sure if, the word slave is the best term to use, because we don't really understand entirely the tributary system in Mesoamerican societies to really have a word for it. But she was given up by her mother after her father's death, and she was taken to Tabasco after being, like I said, of royal Nahua lineage. And then she was gifted to Hernan Cortés, as was common at this point in time through a diplomatic agreement. Indigenous women often sealed diplomatic agreements with other nations, and the incoming conquistadores were considered another foreign nation that was coming in to have diplomatic agreements with indigenous societies. And so she was given among a group of 19 indigenous women to Hernan Cortés. We have to understand that Malinche was absolutely brilliant. Her ability to learn languages, it has been lauded historically. We don't have firsthand accounts from her own perspective. We just have historical accounts in the archives of people writing about her. But I think that we can, as feminists, we can inscribe, what kind of brilliance she really had. She spoke Nahua, that was her first language, and then she learned her second language in Tabasco, and then she picked up Spanish very quickly. And we have to understand that for somebody who was so smart and as written in the transcript, also very curious, a very intellectually curious person, that, she almost knew that this encounter with the Spanish would be another sort of opportunity for her. Maybe an opportunity to also get out of bondage, or to negotiate, her way out of bondage, maybe through the smarts she had in mastering languages. She mastered Spanish very quickly. It was actually quite impressive in the Spanish accounts that we have about her. We have, these testimonies as to how quickly really she was able to learn this third language. The Spanish really revered her for her talents and gave her the name of Doña Marina. And when she did come across the Aztecs, once the diplomatic agreements between the Spanish and the Aztecs began, they also gave her the honorary addendum of Sin, and that's how she became Malinche. She became the critical link between Hernan Cortés and Moctezuma. And hopefully I'm able to also share sound here. I don't really use Zoom that often, so I might need some some guidance from Dr. Baldi here on how to do this. But there is this new documentary called Malinche, The Story of an Enigma, that was released by La UNAM, which is, a very prestigious university in Mexico City, one of the largest public universities in the world, in 2019. And I wanted to go ahead and share a couple of very short clips from the documentary that I wasn't able to really find documentaries in English, but this one does have a historical perspective of a presenter in English that I wanted to share. So let's see here, and please chime in, Dr. Baldi, if you're not able to hear the sound.
Un poco de silencio. No somos animales.
Cortés mandó bautizar a las indígenas y ya con nombres cristianos las fue emparejando con sus hombres.
Que no tengan fortuna, que no se impacienten. Con seguridad, pronto recibiremos nuevas mujeres en el campamento.
The Spanish world that Hernando Cortés and his compañeros were part of was indeed a very machista world. They were coming straight out of the Reconquista, so centuries of warfare, and centuries of warfare tend not to be very good for women. At the same time, we have to remember that Cortés and his companions came as men. There were a few women with them, but very, very few. And I think we all know that an all-male world of warriors does not tend to be profoundly sensitive to the needs of women. So I think it is fair to say that when Malinche passed from the hands of her indigenous captors to the hands of European captors, she was in for some trouble. She could expect the treatment to go worse.
Malinche llamó la atención de Cortés desde un principio.
Malinche herself was given to the most important man in Cortés's entourage. His name was Alonso Puertocarrero, and he was a first cousin to the Conde de Medellin in Spain. He was probably the wealthiest, certainly the most socially important man in the company. And Cortés assigned Malinche to him, the man he most wished to impress and please. So we can be certain that Malinche really was a beautiful girl with a notable presence. He would not have given Puertocarrero an ordinary girl.
A Malinche la bautizaron Marina, el primero de sus nombres en pasar a la historia y del que seguirían posteriormente Malina, Malinche y Malinche. Cortés continuó su viaje con
When Moctezuma came face to face with Cortés, something that we often forget is that the woman standing between them, whom both were looking at and both were speaking to, was Malinche, was an indigenous woman. Moctezuma would have been accustomed to working with translators because he had control over a large area with many people, but he would not have expected a woman from a recently conquered area to stand there in front of him, looking him directly in the eye, as indigenous sources implied that she did, as speaking face to face with power, and asserting herself, as we know that she did.
Nadie osaba mirar directamente al tlatoani, pero aquella india desvergonzada no solo le miraba directamente a los ojos, sino que le hablaba en representación del jefe extranjero y del poderoso ejército invasor que comandaba. La que fuera esclava hablaba ahora de tú a tú con el hombre más poderoso de su mundo.
The Spaniards watched with awe, in a sense, as Malinche managed not only the translation, the literal translation between Moctezuma and Cortés, but also managed the situation, if you will. She understood far better than Cortés, in fact, the political layout of the land. Remember that she herself was the daughter of a lord in the East and had been raised understanding the political situation. She knew what to say and what not to say. And every Spaniard there, whoever spoke about it later, seemed to gain an undying respect for her.
En un mundo regido por hombres, una mujer estaba conduciendo el destino del más poderoso de ellos.
Okay, so as was depicted in the documentary, she was a translator, and she was also functioned as a diplomat. She translated between Chontal and Nahuatl for Hernán Cortés in order to facilitate the conquest of Tenochtitlan, or the conquest in quotes of Tenochtitlan. She became Cortés's mistress and bore him a son, Martín, and then he was the son was kind of cemented in Mexican popular culture as being the birth of the first mestizo. We have to think about whether and Mexicans like to kind of insert a love story there, and I think that that's problematic because we have to think about consent. I think it's important to think about agency in their relationship. And give her, that agency to make decisions to a certain extent. But we also need to think about the power dynamic at play. This was, very much these were patriarchal exchanges, and she was managing her role in these patriarchal exchanges. So can we really infer, love when the sexual encounters that that are described are actually described quite casually? This was an extremely unequal dynamic that Malinche was navigating. The truth is, though, that she did have agency. She was extremely intelligent. One, case where we can see how smart she was is that as a conditioning to accompany Cortés on another expedition after the unfair and circumstantial defeat of Tenochtitlan, she negotiated marrying a Spaniard. She said, if I go with you on this last expedition, she had just given birth to her son, and had to leave him behind. So it was a big deal for her to agree to go. She said, I want to be able to marry a Spanish man. And the reason for that, though history might judge her as, as a quote unquote traitor, was because she actually knew that it would give her status. It would be a way out of bondage for her, and it would give her social status in this new emerging society. And she also asked for an exuberant wedding present. She asked for an encomienda. She was the fourth indigenous person in this emerging society to be given an encomienda. And she specifically asked for an encomienda in Utula. Utula was her homeland. That's where her father had reigned. And so she was able to, become the empress of Utula, to become, the ruler of Utula and a protector of her people in her original homeland with these negotiations. Nonetheless, she's still very much of a controversial figure. She, in Mexican popular culture, she's, particularly inscribed as a traitor. We still have the term today, malinchista, which is used to describe both men and women who betray Mexican, national society as malinchistas, that were traitors, for whatever it may be, for moving to the United States, for buying American. Peña Nieto was called a malinchista when he was trying to privatize Mexican national oil. These are some examples of the way that this term that begins with this woman's story still, is in Mexican popular culture today. She was also became known as la chingada, or the raped one. And, Mexicans use this term, this curse word, la chingada, the fucked one, very, colloquially, and it goes back to referring to Malintzin and the kind of role that she had and the fact that she gave birth to Cortez's son. However, in the feminist reclamation of her roles and her figure, we do see her as I've been saying, as this highly skilled, intelligent woman who really served as a cultural broker and an diplomatic intermediary between nations. And perhaps that led, to saving more indigenous lives than would have perished as the conquistadores, took foot, and they were really, really highly aided by the spread of disease. Malinche becomes then inscribed as the whore in the virgin whore dichotomy in Mexican, popular understandings of gender. This is the virgin whore dichotomy is imported via Catholicism, and Malintzin is, typically associated with the whore out of that dichotomy. Whereas on the other side of that, in Mexican popular culture, we imagine the Virgen de Guadalupe as the other mother of the nation. But she is, of course, saintly. She's chaste, she's pure, she's a protector. She's a mother who will not abandon you. The way that, Malintzin was said to, have abandoned her child on that last final expedition. Although, of course, she did, come back to raise her child. And she's known as La Virgen de Guadalupe is known as also as an intermediary, because she facilitated the spiritual conquest through hybridity. She was a mestiza virgin that was here to convince indigenous people to convert. And so she becomes, the other side of the coin there within the virgin whore dichotomy, whereas Malintzin is reinscribed over and over again as the whore. So from here, I want to move on to think about 3 moments that cement mestizaje as a nationalist project in Mexican history. Before I do that, however, I do want to expand on how I'm thinking about La Malinche and how I'm thinking about her as a particular moment that does define Mexican identity, a moment that we haven't entirely escaped and that we haven't entirely dealt with as Mexicans because of, her continuous reinscription as a traitor, rather than, as a diplomat and the intelligent woman that she was. Influential male and Mexican intellectuals like Octavio Paz have insisted that Mexicans have an unresolved relationship with the rape of La Malinche. In Los Hijxs de la Malinche, Paz stipulates that in proclaiming that Mexicans are hijos de la chingada, Mexicans eternally tie themselves to Hernán Cortés's mistress. As Paz states, La chingada is the mother forcibly opened, violated, or deceived. El hijo de la chingada is the offspring of violation, abduction, or deceit. To the Spaniard, dishonor consists in being the son of a woman who voluntarily surrenders herself, a prostitute. To the Mexican, it consists of being the fruit of that violation. Paz goes on to connect La Chingada to the rape of La Malinche, as he states, if La Chingada is a representation of the violated mother, it is appropriate to associate her with the conquest, which was also a violation in the very flesh of Indian women. The symbol of this violation is Doña Malinche. It is true that she gave herself voluntarily to the conquistador, but he forgot her as soon as her usefulness was over. The Mexican people have not forgiven La Malinche for her betrayal. She embodies the open, the chingado, to our closed, stoic, and passive Indians. I first take issue with Paz's assertion that La Malinche surrendered her body voluntarily. She was being held in bondage, and though she had agency in deciding what was good for her in that particular situation, archival evidence tells us that Indigenous women were undoubtedly raped during and after the conquest. Recently, historian Andrés Reséndez undertook the work of linking enslavement to sexual exploitation and trafficking during the colonial period in his book, The Other Slavery, where he presents archival evidence to demonstrate that slavers preferred to export Indigenous women and children to Europe, partly because Indigenous slaves were procured for domestic labor in Spain and Italy, but also because, quote, women were less threatening than men and could easily be sexually exploited, unquote. And additionally, he claims that traffickers went to great lengths to procure willing Indians, particularly children, who were more easily tricked and manipulated than adults. The profits from the other slavery, as Reséndez terms it, were ranked according to gender and race. Reséndez's numerical analysis of the prices paid for Indigenous slaves throughout Latin America revealed a higher cost for women, followed by girls, boys, and then men. Muskogee Creek scholar Sarah Deer similarly claims that there was rampant rape of Indigenous women and girls at the beset of colonization. She opens her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, with the graphic first-person account of a conquistador raping an Indigenous woman in Española. The rape of Indigenous women carried on into the colonial period when Indigenous women were distributed in the encomienda and hacienda systems as domestic laborers who were often forced into concubinage with peninsulares or criollos. For Paz, La Malinche remains only violated flesh to conquistadores, despite her many feats and her ability to gain prominence in the diplomatic relations happening at the time in what would become Mexican society. She is but a representation of a raped mother, the continuous open wound that Mexicans haven't been able to come to terms with. Paz does not at all mention the prominence of Indigenous women in Mesoamerican society or in contemporary autonomy movements. We are only reduced to our moment of rape. Furthermore, Paz draws a dichotomy between the Virgen de Guadalupe and La Malinche to explain how Mexicans understand the virgin whore dichotomy. La Malinche, the screwed one, is relegated to the whore status, while Guadalupe becomes a symbol of maternal protectiveness and chastity. Even though Chicana feminists have analyzed the role of both female symbols as intermediaries and intercessors during a period of colonial violence and have moved towards granting Malinche both intellectual and sexual agency, it is evident that Mexico never fully came to terms with the rape and or perceived betrayal of La Malinche. Malinchismo has been alive and well throughout Mexican history, persisting as one of the most prominent gendered stereotypes that haunt the representation of Indigenous women in the Americas. The Mexican government glossed over the sexual violence that birthed the country during the period of post-revolution reconstruction, choosing to elevate instead the consummation of mixed raceness when it intentionally chose to celebrate mestizaje as a new Mexican national identity. The rape of Indigenous women and the resultant trauma that gendered violence imbued into the mixed race Mexican population was pushed under the rug in the birthing of La Raza Cósmica as a harmonious conglomeration of the races. This intentional erasure not only of indigeneity, but of the post-traumatic stress disorder created by conquest and rape has provoked a sense of loss and mixed race anxiety among Mexico's mestizo population. Furthermore, it has provoked the continuous erasure and sidelining of Afro-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, who at best don't see themselves represented in this narrative of the nation, and at worst have been severely affected by nationalist campaigns to exterminate or assimilate them. In my work, I theorize that mestizos suffer from mixed race anxiety as a result of the unresolved trauma from the wounds of colonial gendered violence. I study mestizo native interactions in Michoacán using anthropological methods to unveil the power dynamics that are ever present between Indigenous people and middle-class Mexican mestizos. These present-day dynamics and consequences play out in very gendered ways, even for working-class Mexicans. First, mestizo men mourn emasculation as the products of rape and their cries of being hijos de la chingada. And secondly, mestiza women bear the burden of being viewed as traitors while not being able to name or heal from their female ancestors' experience with sexual violence. In this way, Mexican mestizos are stuck in a liminal mourning of identity, which then plays out in interesting and problematic performances of indigeneity. The resulting mourning, melancholia, conflicted love, and indigenous critiques of mestizo loss is something I'm going to elaborate on in my book, Mestizo Melancholia and the Legacy of Conquest in Michoacan. So I'm identifying 3 critical moments in Mexican history that that cement our current understanding of mestizaje, that concretize our current understanding of mestizaje. The first one is the colonial period, el sistema de las castas, which I'm going to be getting into. The second one is the Mexican Revolution that ends in 1910. And the third one is the Chicano movement, as adding the layer of greater Mexico as the experience of Mexican Americans here in the United States. Beginning with the casta system, we actually have a great amount of documentation of the way that the casta system functioned and how it was understood in Mexican colonial society after the Spanish conquest, because we have these amazing casta paintings that depicted the different categorizations to where mixed race people in Mexico, in Mexican colonial society, would fall under. The casta system was based on the Spanish concept of limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood. And it categorized people according to the different races that they were mixed in. And we have to understand, this concept of purity of blood as a Spanish concept that applied to social organization. And we have to understand that at the time of the Spanish conquest, Spaniards were particularly obsessed with categorizing people according to how much old pure Christian blood people had, coming out of numerous wars in Europe over that particular contention. It was important to basically, in this new colonial society, there was a great amount of racial anxiety over what to do with this mixed race population. So it was important to have categories to put people in, that would enact, who could pay taxes, who would have access to voting, to owning land, who would have access to basically having a more equal experience in this colonial society. These categorizations were complex. They numbered more than 16. And as I mentioned, they demonstrated the Criollo and Peninsular population's anxiety and hysteria over, maintaining basically a white supremacist racial socioeconomic regime in colonial Mexico. They worked alongside a social culture economic model of classification that included this dichotomy between gente de razón and gente sin razón. Gente de razón were considered people with reason, and those were typically people who had more white lineage in them. And gente sin razón were considered people who were who didn't have the ability to reason as much because they were more mixed race, and or they lived in the countryside. So another point that defined this gente sin razón issue was also locality. So being a plebeian also added to your inability to not have as much access to reason. Having calidad, or having quality, was another factor that took into account where you would fall in the category within the casta system. And that calidad was measured by everything from skin color to people's occupation, how much wealth they had access to, their mixed raceness or blood, their honor and their integrity, their reputation, and their place of origin. This is just, to give you a visual of all of the different, categories and the way that they enacted these particular identities that depended on racial mixing. So there is no doubt that the castas reinforced Eurocentrism. Mestizos became associated with illegitimate birth. They were, the castas bastardized mestizaje. Mestizos, and many of these categories were banned from positions of power and prestige. And because indigenous people were to become the new Christians, they were, granted, some protection by the Spanish crown, yet we're still associated with like that countryside, with agriculture, with unskilled labor, being people who were not, able to reason, and typically became tribute paying, folks in this colonial society. The The casta paintings really show us the way that Blackness and indigeneity was relegated, not only to like this, inability to reason, of being gente sin razón, but also, folks that were, innately dirty, ignorant, folks who were expendable for labor, who, really were not, a valuable part to this new society. So for example, here at the top painting, as you see, we have a depiction of a Black woman. And this is a very typical depiction of Black women in the casta paintings, where they're seen as, almost like unintelligible, coming through in the painting as people who, are fighting with others, who are yelling at people. Like the stereotype of the angry Black woman is definitely in these casta paintings, or who, are trying to dominate a home, with their emotions. And then on the bottom part here, the second casta painting is actually called Indios Bárbaros, barbarian Indians. And it shows, how, a couple of, or a family would be completely gente sin razón, people without reason, based on the fact that they, were still living their traditional ways at this point in time, still speaking their language, and still living in their traditional territories. This is, the way that the racial hierarchy fell according to the casta system. And so you had peninsulares at the top, and then criollos. Criollos were peninsulares at the top were people of Spanish descent who were born in Spain, but were living in Mexico. Criollos were people who were born in Mexico, but had Spanish blood, entirely Spanish blood. Mestizos were right underneath them. And then caciques, indigenous royalty, people who descended from indigenous chiefs and leaders. And then on the very bottom, the Indios Bárbaros, the barbarian Indians, like the ones that were, depicted in the previous, in the painting that I showed in the previous slide, and also enslaved Black people at the bottom there. So another critical moment that I'm, that I'm not necessarily, going into deeply, but that I do want to mention as well, because it also is a moment important to understanding how mestizaje is inscribed in Mexican national identity, is the War of Independence to free Mexico of its relationship with Spain. So we have to think about the fact that Mexican colonial society functioned along the lines of, this distribution of land through the hacienda system. And the hacienda system was connected to mining, and it was connected to the economic model of mercantilism, which was economic extraction from the colony through mining, and then taking those resources like silver and gold to pay off debts owed by Spain or owed by the colonizing entity. So, we see, in that particular model of mercantilism, there isn't an investment of building infrastructure in the colony. So it's very, very extractive, and it disempowers folks who are at the bottom of that society, who are basically just laborers, who never really see any benefits to their labor, because it's a system of exploitation. The people who ruled Mexico and Mexican colonial society were all Spanish. And so that, and they were people who were appointed, who ruled from the mainland of Spain. So there were many, angry criollos, angry people of Spanish descent who lived and worked in Mexico at this particular, inability to have any say in the way that they were being ruled. And there were also angry mestizos. And that sort of led, to this call for independence, very famously by this priest, Miguel Hidalgo in 1810, who gives this Grito de Dolores for independence in Dolores, Guanajuato. He actually has a very short involvement in the revolution, even though he inspires it with this call for arms, for independence. He's killed in 1811, shortly after, that call for arms is initiated. But he's actually known as, the most famous figure in the War of Independence. He's this light-skinned mestizo. And his with his Virgen of Guadalupe banner. This is a very typical representation of the Mexican War of Independence. It's less known that the widespread indigenous participation in the war. The army was 50% indigenous, and there was also a large contingent of Afro-Mexican warriors from La Costa Chica. That's where Jose Maria Morelos, the quote unquote mulatto, who was also an active participant and leader in the War of Independence. He recruited the Afro-Mexican warriors from La Costa Chica. So in 1821, that's the end of Spanish rule. And this concretizes, Mexican nationalism as being attached to Miguel Hidalgo and being attached to La Virgen de Guadalupe. We become again the sons and daughters of the Virgen de Guadalupe, who was there with, priest Miguel Hidalgo, to inspire this revolutionary war and to guide us into victory. What gets erased, this is why this is also a narrative of what becomes mestizaje. What gets erased from this moment more popularly is, as I mentioned, the indigenous participation and the Black participation in the War of Independence. If we think about enslaved Black people, they're probably thinking that if they participate, as warriors in this war, it might also mean the end of slavery in Mexico. So we don't often learn about the influential roles of Afro-Mexican revolutionaries like Jose Maria Morelos, Juan Alvarez, and Vicente Guerrero, who became the president of Mexico and went on to abolish slavery in 1829. Before the Mexican Revolution took place, we also had a dictator in Mexico who was influential in the way that we think about La Raza Cósmica and about mestizaje. His name was Porfirio Diaz. I have his dates there in terms of years. And Porfirio Diaz was very much of a self-hating Mexican. He really wanted to, fall in line with being considered European. He denied his own indigenous heritage. He powdered his face. Like, these are all things that we know about Porfirio Diaz, and he called himself Latin. And that's, that's where we actually get, through his diplomatic relations with France, that's where we get the word Latino today. It comes from these early inscriptions of Latinidad by Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz invested in building up the Mexican infrastructure. That could be considered, like probably the only, positive thing from his reign. But it was an extremely unequal society. He really, privatized land through the latifundo, land ownership structure. And he also actually privatized communally owned indigenous land. And so he was horrible for indigenous people. And he was really, with his own self-hating ways, he was very anti-Indian. He granted land titles of huge acreage to a very elite few. It was just such an unequal society. And then including, privatizing land to grant land grants to foreigners, to rich foreigners. And he forced people off of, what became privatized land under his rule. And so, for example, just to show you, how unequal this society was, by 1910, only 2% of the population held titles to land, and only 10% of indigenous communities had, still had their communal land. What happens then is that once again, becomes a revolutionary moment in Mexican history, where, people start, organizing an overthrow, basically, poor people, poor campesinos from the countryside start, thinking about how are we going to get rid of this, of Porfirio Diaz and, and enact a more equal government and get some of the land back that was taken from indigenous communities. And from campesino communities. So in the north, we have Pancho Villa, who's moving moving down with his troops, and then in the south we have Emiliano Zapata, and Emiliano Zapata was indigenous himself. He was Nahua, and his grandfathers spoke Nahua, and these two revolutionaries, meet at the center to overthrow what they saw as a monarchy. what happened after the Mexican Revolution is that Francisco Madero was elected, President Madero was elected, and over 100 million acres, that's half of Mexican national territory, was redistributed to poor landless campesinos and also to indigenous communities through the ejido system. So, so the revolution in that sense, was good in terms of the new economic model that emerged, which did redistribute land. But there was also this sense of, this large looming question of who are we, like who are we as a society, and what is our identity in this new society after the revolution happened. And what happens here is that under the new presidency relies on Mexican intellectuals to answer that question about who we are. So Mexican intellectual thinkers of that time, like Jose Vasconcelos, become very influential in nationalizing Mexican identity, so that we can have this harmonious period of reconstruction and actually become a new nation. It was also influenced by policymakers like Manuel Gamio, and by Mexican artists, Mexican muralists, that are very famous now, Los Tres Grandes, Diego Rivera and Siqueiros and Orozco. They were all commissioned to paint these murals representing what would become, nationalized Mexican identity. So we have two scholars, Guillermo Bonfil Batalla and Natividad Gutierrez, who identify this period as an assimilationist time during which indigenous people were forced basically to Mexicanize for the sake of the government's post-revolution nation building project. Jose Vasconcelos is particularly prominent in the invention of la raza cósmica, the cosmic race, as a reinscription of Mexican national identity. In his book La Raza Cósmica, dated 1925, he theorized that the mestiza or mestizo was the ideal racial subject because she or he took the best genetic qualities from each group. Vasconcelos attributed mestizos' sensual and bodily contributions to African and indigenous descent, saying that Mexicans got their ability to sustain brute labor, from their African descent, and that, they got their ability to sustain long hours of labor from their indigenous descent. And that they got their rhythm, also from their indigenous and African descent. So very kind of like physical type of attributes, were granted to indigeneity and Blackness, whereas the ability to reason and more intellectual attributes were granted to European contributions from the Spanish to mestizaje. So in and of itself, it does read very much like a eugenics, book. And then, we have scholarship now. For example, one of my colleagues that I went to graduate school with, Dr. Agustin Palacios, who teaches out in California, wrote this great article called Multicultural Vasconcelos, where he really analyzes, Vasconcelos' white supremacist tendencies and ties to even studying Hitler. And so, we kind of see how then these eugenics influences, actually lead to the creation of la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race, and how indigeneity and Blackness continues to be seen as, as inferior even within the celebration of mixed raceness. Mestizaje becomes a state project, by all means, not only under Vasconcelos popularizing this ideology of la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race, but also ideologically with the painting of murals, as I was saying, by Los Tres Grandes, who popularized Tenochtitlan as the origin story. So this is also an act of erasure, Tenochtitlan, even though we want to celebrate it as, this amazing, pre-colonial city that everybody gasped at, the fact that it was a huge city that was, that, the way that it was built, its architecture, etc. It also, erases the diversity of indigenous societies that existed in Mesoamerica, as well as, the diversity of indigenous societies that still, that exist today. And so one of them was, one of these factors of Mestizaje as a state project was that popularizing of Tenochtitlan as the origin story, which to this day is still taught to K through 12 students in Mexico. The second one was the adoption of the Spanish language, officially and entirely, and that also promoted an obliteration of indigenous languages, a complete divestment from preserving them, and even an assimilationist campaign to end them. The assimilation of Western values derived from Hispanic influences, so encouraging everybody to Mexicanize into these Hispanic influences and values. The material and intellectual manifestations of Westernized culture, and then finally codifying or re-articulating the moment of violent rape of La Malinche and other indigenous and also enslaved Black women as a harmonious encounter in the birthing of mestizos and mestizaje. And I think that this is where, we really get it wrong as Mexicans. This is where things really go south, because that moment of gendered violence, as I was insisting when I shared part of my writing here, is something that that to this day, we don't understand, what it means, and it's what causes, for example, mestizos and mestizas to turn to indigeneity to try to understand and to try to heal. And sometimes those dynamics and that turning to indigeneity can actually be on quite unequal grounds that still, promote the erasure of contemporary indigenous people. Bonfil Batalla and Natividad Gutierrez, who are scholars that I cited earlier, very prominent in sort of early indigenous studies scholars in Mexico, do say that the policies that were enacted during this period in time that were kind of, under the banner of indigenista policies were ethnocide. Indigenismo institutionally translated into a set of policies that were meant to bring indigenous people into quote unquote modernity. This is a quote from Natividad Gutierrez that I have here about how that was going to happen, how indigenous people were going to be brought out of their anachronistic cultures and into the modern moment, into the mainstream, and to be Mexicanized. So one example of the way that happens under Gamio's influence is that this recruiting of young indigenous men from Indian villages who were sent to Mexico City to get trained in how to teach Spanish, and then were sent back to their villages to teach Spanish only, and to, help obliterate indigenous languages. It's important to note that, as always, indigenous people, have resisted, if we think about the meaning of Indigenous Peoples Day that way too. And some tribes and nations refuse development projects, including the Raramuri people, the Huichol people, refused development projects from the Mexican government if these were the terms. If the terms were that they had to give up their language and their culture. According to Gutierrez and Batalla, who I've been citing, the post-revolution nation building project succeeded in racializing indigenous people as unnecessary impediments to progress. The notion of indigenous inferiority was also, for example, reinscribed here in the way that indigenous people are positioned in Diego Rivera's paintings as always remnants of the past, and what's missing are contemporary indigenous people and their interests. So how do we get then El Día de la Raza? Well, it comes from Vasconcelos. Vasconcelos starts promoting how we should celebrate La Raza Cósmica, and then Columbus Day and October 12th, that marks his arrival to the Americas, becomes a way to celebrate mestizaje and a way to celebrate when the race was born. So it's known as, literally like the birth of the race started with this violent moment of colonization. And so, one of the reasons that it's problematic, besides, just the statement that I just made about it, is that it acknowledges, that history in the Americas begins with the arrival of Columbus, completely, ignoring that, that there were already, thriving societies here, that maybe we should think about celebrating that through like Indigenous Peoples Day, instead of tracing our origin story to to, you know, to the arrival of Columbus. So maybe we could have, you know, like the day of like creation stories instead as a national holiday, and we could think about the diversity, you know, of origin stories that existed in Mexico and Latin America before the arrival of Columbus. But instead, this is what we get. We get a celebration of his arrival, and you know, as a way to acknowledge that this is, you know, this is where we came from, and this is where mestizaje begins. And so I question, you know, is it the birth of, you know, of a new way of living, the birth of a new knowledge that arrives in the Americas, you know, like the right knowledge because it's European knowledge, and these kind of Eurocentric, you know, determinations of Columbus's arrival? Or is it an epistemic break, you know, that happens where indigenous knowledge is actually interrupted at this point in time? And even though it endures today, you know, through several like preservation efforts, you know, and there are, you know, widely spoken indigenous languages, like for example, Purepecha, you know, this was, you know, a violent interruption in indigenous epistemologies and in indigenous ways of life that happened with Columbus, but we don't talk about that. You know, we don't talk about those political interests of indigenous communities when we think about El Día de la Raza in Mexico or in Latin America. Bonfil Batalla really asked us to think critically about this with his book, México Profundo. So this is a quote from the book. "The clear and undeniable evidence of our Indian ancestry is a mirror in which we do not wish to see our own reflection." Bonfil Batalla asks us to think about the Mexico Profundo, or, you know, what we gained and learned from Mesoamerican civilizations, and how that is actually what would lead us to really understand our identity versus what he calls the Mexico Imaginario. The Mexico Imaginario is this construct of mestizaje to him, and he also actually calls mestizaje ethnocide. And you know, this is from his book. "The dominant group has illegally held political, economic, and ideological power, which originated with the European invasion, and doesn't allow us to be able to look in that mirror and see who we really are as de-Indianized people." And so now I'm moving to the third moment here that I want to talk a little bit about, which is the way that Chicanos in the United States, vis-a-vis the Chicano movement, also rely on some of these constructs of, you know, of Mexican nationalism in their own emergence of a Chicano identity. So it's important to kind of think about, you know, why was there a Chicano movement to begin with? And so I'm just gonna cover a little bit of, you know, of what led to this actual important civil rights movement. It really goes back to the U.S. Mexico War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was not honored by the United States after the U.S.-Mexico War, so there were many tensions and a great deal of violence and discrimination against Mexican heritage people. There was widespread squatting by Anglo settlers on California and Tejano lands, although, you know, I want to acknowledge that those California and Tejano lands were indigenous lands that, you know, belonged to indigenous groups before the Mexican nation state emerged as well. But these elite landowners, you know, experienced a great amount of squatting, and they had titles from the Spanish crown to large plots of lands in places like California and Texas that were annexed into the United States after the U.S.-Mexico War. There was a great amount of lynchings of Mexicans. This is something that is not, you know, widely known in American history. I have a book here, you know, an image of a book here, "The Injustice Never Leaves You" by one of our colega in Chicano Latino Studies, Mónica Muñoz, Dr. Mónica Muñoz Martinez, that I encourage you to check out if you want to learn some of this history. You know, there were thousands of Mexicans that were lynched, second only to African Americans in the country in terms of numbers of lynchings. And this, you know, this happened under, like, you know, so-called, you know, gringo justice, or because of Anglo settler, you know, tendencies in these lands that were annexed after the U.S.-Mexico War. We have to consider also the widespread disenfranchisement. Mexican Americans were supposed to be granted full citizenship after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but that was enforced at the local level, and which really means that it wasn't often enforced, and that they were stripped of their, their right to vote, their right to have a say in local governments, etc. And also Mexicans were subjected, to greaser acts, where they could be arrested just basically, just for being Mexicans. And there was also segregation, widespread segregation socially. Mexicans were subjected to Jim Crow in places like California, as well as segregation in schooling. We have, a couple of famous cases, one of which is the Mendez versus Westminster case that actually precedes the Brown case, as Mexicans tried to fight, school segregation and the way that it impacted their children and the opportunities that their children could have. So the Chicano movement really, it starts in 1968 and it goes through the 1980s. Has these different facets, as a response to these injustices that people of Mexican descent, Mexican heritage were facing after the U.S.-Mexico War. One of those facets is, of course, education. We have the 1968 East LA walkouts that happen and that establish, Chicano Latino studies really as a field begins with that demand for Mexican American history and better and equal treatment of Mexican American students in public schools. Secondly, another wing of the Chicano movement is the United Farm Workers movement. The anti-war movement, the very famous Chicano moratorium, which happens in Los Angeles in 1970. There's also a demand for material reparations through Take Back the Land by Reyes Lopez Tijerina. The wing of, there's a cultural revolution, the Chicano Renaissance that happens as well through the production of El Teatro Campesino and a great amount of literary production, also particularly by Chicanas. And then there's also a nationalism that enacts itself in the call for a political party, a people's party, La Raza Unida. And this is where I also want to talk about the popular use of La Raza as also, meaning like, basically working class people. That's also the way that it's been popularized in Mexico and in the United States. And so I do want to acknowledge, that this is also the way that it's used, even though it has these origins in Vasconcelos's, eugenic ideologies. Chicana feminism is another wing of the Chicano movement. And then we also have queer Chicano interventions that happen in the 1980s. And I also want to mention that there is a parallel civil rights uprising in the East Coast by the Puerto Rican young lords that's also Latino, Latinx. But what I want to focus on, for this particular talk is the way that the Chicano movement's idea of indigeneity continues to rely on these constructs of Mexican nationalism, to basically, reinscribe Chicanos as de-Indianized indigenous people. So El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, if you ever get a chance to read it, Alurista is said to have written the preamble in 1969. It has many of these references, to indigenous people, the people who work the earth are the people who own the earth. We're part of this land through Aztlán. The Southwest, used to be the original homeland of the Aztecs, and so this is, this land then, belongs to us, and we have a right to have, equal treatment and to reemerge as a Chicano nation, as the Bronze people. Those are some of, the quick analysis that I can offer from Alurista's preamble there. This other famous poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, by Luis Valdez, Daniel Valdez, Corky Gonzalez in 1969, also has a great amount of references specifically to Tenochtitlan and specifically to Cuauhtemoc. This is continuously rendered as male and Aztec centric in terms of like how are Chicanos, to be indigenous. It's through this male and Aztec centric sort of, identity production. And and it is, you know, strategic essentialism that's going on here, and I do want to acknowledge that. But it also does reproduce Natividad Gutierrez's contradiction that I was talking about earlier, which is how Indians of the past are glorified, while Indians, you know, of the present in Mexico are sort of, you know, not acknowledged, specifically, you know, in this reproduction of Aztec popularity that continues to render other indigenous communities or heritages invisible. The major critiques that emerge in the 1970s and 80s of the Chicano movement are the reliance on la raza and mestizaje, you know, as reproducing a nationalism that sidelines indigenous people and Afro descendants. Secondly, the silencing of women through malinchismo. The Chicanas who did want to participate in the women's movement were considered, you know, malinchistas, or who wanted to bring feminist issues into the Chicano civil rights movement were considered, you know, were called traitors, and as well as as homophobia. What happens with this critiques, and I'm getting ready to wrap up here because I do want to, you know, have some time for some questions, is that what happens in these critiques is that there is this, for example, reclamation of La Malinche. I encourage you to read a very famous poem by Carmen Tafoya, it's kind of like a response to Yo Soy Joaquin, where she talks about, you know, like how La Malinche influences Chicana identity. There are, you know, queer Chicana feminist theories on homeland and Aztlán that also intervene there to call out the homophobia and the sexism in the Chicano movement. Some of the famous theories by Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, are the Coatlicue state, the Coyoshaki principle, and Mestiza consciousness. But even, you know, with these trailblazing interventions that I really give them credit for, you know, as the queer Chicana interventions, the important queer Chicana interventions that they made, there's still reliance on La Raza as a construct and on silencing indigeneity through the references to indigenous antecedents or indigenous, you know, cosmology as what's important, rather than an engagement with contemporary indigenous communities. Gloria Anzaldúa reinscribes mestizaje and Mexica centrism in her work. And her theories can be useful in the reclamation of matriarchy. That's how I have found them useful. But I do think that, you know, there's a need for a relationship to a contemporary indigenous community to avoid falling into, you know, this reproduction of La Raza. There are some overlooked collaborations that I'll quickly mention, you know, and sometimes, you know, the way that these critiques are launched against the Chicano movement and Chicano identity, and I don't want to fall into the same, you know, erasure of these collaborations. And so it's important to note that the Chicano movement, you know, did collaborate with the Black Power movement and also with the American Indian movement. One example that we have of that is DQ University, which is a tribal college in California that began, you know, as an effort between Chicanos and American Indians. Secondly, the collaborations between Chicanos and Zapatistas, there's been many examples, you know, in after 1994 that happened in, you know, places like Los Angeles where people were practicing Zapatismo or had, you know, Chiapas support committees and, you know, fundraising and participating even in the conferences that followed, directly collaborating with Zapatista communities. Nonetheless, you know, acknowledging that, I also want to end by sharing some of the critiques, you know, of the construct of La Raza and the way that it is still harmful to contemporary indigenous people and to Afro descendants. And I'll end with that. I won't be able to share because we're out of time. I won't be able to necessarily share you know, the way that I'm thinking or celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day now. But critical at Latinx indigeneities is a framework which has been introduced by Indigenous scholars, to, you know, contemporary Indigenous scholars, to think about and to critically engage with the experiences of Indigenous migrants from Latin America in a way that centers Indigenous perspectives and that gets, you know, that critiques the construct of Latinidad. Because Latinidad can fall into that trap of continuous erasure with its reliance on some of these nationalist constructs. So some of these interventions that I'll quickly cover here, rejecting the calls to be assimilated into Latinidad. So this is, for example, in the work of Dr. David Barrios Chon and Dr. Luis Urrieta, a couple of my colleagues in the Critical Latinx Indigeneities Working Group, where they talk about, how indigenous migrants from Latin America experience racism in schools, not just from white, peers or white students, but also from Latinos or Mexican Americans who use racist terms, for example, like Oaxaquita, diminutive terms to make fun or mock indigenous children, and how that can have, long-term impacts, psychological impacts on indigenous identity formation at those tender ages. Secondly, thinking between critical connections between racism, gender, and migration. This is the work of Dr. Shannon Speed and Dr. Flori Boch Lopez, where they specifically are thinking about the way that that indigenous women migrants from Latin America reenact indigenous identity, and also experience a great amount of erasure and violence in their migrant. With Dr. Shannon Speed, she talks about those migrant journeys, and those journeys in detention as particular neoliberal moments of gendered violence. Whereas I'm citing a talk by Dr. Boch Lopez that she gave at MALCS 2 years ago at the MALCS conference, where she was critically thinking about the ICE killing of Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez in 2018, a migrant who was murdered, and thinking about that as indigenous death rather than the way that the story was co-opted by Latinidad. And lastly, this is coming from my colleague at UCLA, Maylee Blackwell, Dr. Maylee Blackwell, thinking about multiple colonialities and the way that indigenous migrants from Latin America experience these multiple levels of colonialities. So one level would be, the displacement, the neoliberal displacement from communities of origin, having to go through the migration to survive. And then when they get here, there's, white supremacy as the colonial level, the macro colonial level. But then there's also Latinidad supremacy at the level within the internal communities that can happen, where indigenous people are still marginalized within Latino communities. And just to quickly mention also Afro-descendant interventions, we've heard more about these interventions this year because of the uprising that happened this summer through Black Lives Matter. But they've been interventions that have been ongoing by Afro-Latino scholars too, and Afro-Latino activists and artists. So one thing that they insist upon is that race and within Latinidad matters, right? So that we have to think about, about Blackness more within Latinidad, and ensure that that Black Latinas and Latinos have their own spaces and their own voices, and and that we elevate those voices when we think about, what it means to be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And so, for example, here I have an image of somebody holding up a sign on a project that says, at a protest that says Latinos for Black Lives, and that's been critiqued as an elevation of Latinidad over Blackness, which is, similar critique to what I'm making here in terms of how La Raza Cósmica has been held up, and how the, as if we think about Columbus Day as El Día de la Raza, it falls into that same, that same problem of relying on nationalist constructs. And so I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about these Afro-descendant, Afro-Latinx interventions, to follow the Black Latinas No Collective, because they've been, great about producing social media content to help us understand the way that Afro-descendant folks are intervening in the narrative of Latinidad. And so I will end there to leave room for questions. And I'm happy to have a discussion with folks that are participating.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for taking us through so much, like in this period of time. And I really appreciate all the work that it seems like you put into this. We do have a couple of questions for you that came through the Q&A. The first is, what's encomienda?
Yes, so encomienda was a System where Spanish descended people in in colonial Mexico were granted a plot of land. And these were actually huge plots of land and they actually came with workers. They came with enslaved indigenous people and enslaved Black people that would be part of that land grant. And so that labor was exploited, typically attached to both domestic labor as well as perhaps mining or working the land, farm work, etc. But it was basically, almost like like a plantation, where the plot of land came with forced labor or encouraged labor by indigenous folks that had just gotten converted to Christianity.
And the next question is, I'm not sure if you said you've written a book or you're working on one now, but I'm interested, what's the title and can you tell us about it?
Yes, I'm working on my book now, and it's called Mestizo Melancolia and the Legacy of Conquest in Michoacan. And in this book, I analyze ethnographic events in my homeland in Michoacan through a performance studies lens. And what that means is that I take a look at interactions between mestizas and mestizos and indigenous people in Michoacan to think critically about the way that power relations are enacted in appropriations of indigeneity. So one way that I look at that is actually we're getting very close to celebrating the Days of the Dead here in the United States, now that it's celebrated here as well. And so I look at the way that our grave sites are toured in Michoacan, indigenous grave sites specifically, and the reason why, I call it it's like a consumption only. I mean, it was fascinating to me since I was a little girl why you would go tour, other people's grave sites, and to think about power, how Mexican mestizos also participate in those particular visits, and in inhabiting indigenous communities during the Days of the Dead, when Mexicans are actually told that you're supposed to stay home to to commune with your own dead, and or go to the cemetery and build your altars there. So what is it about indigenous people that is so fascinating? And I think it reveals, in my book I talk about how it reveals critical questions around mestizaje, around that mixed race anxiety that I was speaking about, around wanting to see indigenous people as pre-colonial people, still, like I really want to see the way that they do things there, specifically because it's going to show me how Indians used to do things, with at the same time ignoring the fact that Michoacan right now is an active resistance, is a site of active armed resistance, that these communities are engaged in an autonomous, a political struggle for autonomy, for governmental autonomy, with a war that's being waged against drug cartels and the Mexican government. So when I talk to tourists, like, do you know about any of that? They don't know about any of that, right? What they care about is just being able to observe, the way that indigenous people mourn, basically, and the way that and to buy, arts and crafts from them. So so in my book, I deal with those with those power relations from a critical perspective, and enact also an indigenous criticism of this touring that happens.
And the next question I can answer, it's about, it says, this is important information and I will definitely want to review it and study again later. Will this recording be shared after the presentation? And I wanted to let everybody on the recording know that yes, so we'll put it up onto the Native American Studies, HSU Native American Studies YouTube channel. If you don't follow us on YouTube yet, you should. And we have also been streaming live on Facebook. So if you're looking for the immediate recording following this presentation, it will be live on our Facebook page pretty much right after we stop broadcasting. They'll do whatever Facebook does to it, and then it'll be up there. So there's two ways that you could, that way you can access it right away, and then we'll be uploading it to YouTube also. The next question is there somewhere I can go to see the list of texts and authors that you've talked about in the book or in the presentation?
Yeah. No, there isn't, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to share those with you. I can kind of go through my slides here and compile a list, or maybe I don't know if I can share I can share that list with Dr. Baldi, and then maybe you all can make it available along with the recording or whatnot. But yes, I'm happy to share that information.
That's a good idea. We can put it like underneath the videos and the YouTube and things so people can see them. So yeah, we can definitely do that. So the next question is, thank you so much, Dr. Spears-Rico. What an amazing presentation. Thank you. I am curious if you write about the reclaiming or different use of La Raza by working class folks. I'm curious about that tension and if you would consider that a reclamation. Thank you for your work.
Yeah, you know, the way that it's come across in my ethnographic work itself is that I do work in a mestizo ejido. I've also been interested as an ethnographic example. Another one that I analyzed besides the Day of the Dead is the way that mestizas use indigenous clothing to worship La Virgen de Guadalupe. That's completely fascinating to me as another indigenous appropriation. But in the ejido that I work on, this working class identity and the way that it unifies, you know, folks to indigeneity, where they feel like, you know, because we are all poor, we are all Indians. You know, that's a direct quote from, you know, from my ethnographic work. You know, how that is, you know, then does relate to that, you know, to that construct of La Raza as being, you know, pueblos, as being people, you know, who are poor, as being people who struggle together against, you know, against the hegemony of the state. And so I do think, you know, it'll emerge in my work. I'm not finished with that chapter yet, but it'll emerge in my work in that particular analysis of this ejido and how indigenous identity there is being thought through class, you know, more so than through, you know, we're real Indians because we have, you know, government recognition, the way that it is thought about, for example, in my hometown in Mexico. So yes, I do hope to think about that more. You know, that wasn't necessarily the focus of this particular presentation. I think it's important.
Thank you. So the next question is, my Ama's side is from Colima, Michoacan. Could you tell me anything about the history of the indigenous people that lived there?
From Colima, Michoacan. You know, I would have to, I'm not as familiar with Colima. I work very much more at the center, and you know, by the areas by Morelia. So I would have to, you know, see, like, what I recommend that you do is that you look at your town's archives. That's how I found a great amount of information for my town. You know, you would be surprised that, you know, they probably do have, you know, historiographers that have worked on archives within the town itself. And you know, and to start there, you know, and if the town itself doesn't have an archive, you can ask to access the archives that are in Morelia. And in Morelia, they do hold archives for many of these municipalities and these towns. You know, Mexican historians really dig deep into them to understand the way that, for example, identities shifted between indigeneity and mestizaje. So I really encourage you, as well as to talk to, you know, people in your family. One way that I found out of my mother's hometown was just one day, you know, somebody, an auntie, told me, "Oh, did you know that like this isn't where we were always from?" You know, in my 20s, she told me we came from this other place called Uruetaro, and I was like, okay, you know, so I have a whole nother kind of, you know, research project to do now on Uruetaro and what Uruetaro was, because that's where the people who, you know, became part of this ejido were originally from. So also, you know, talking to your family about, you know, identity shifts within that specific municipality will help as well.
The next is a comment. It says, wow, Gabby, this is a lot of information. Gracias, toda esta documentación es eye-opening. Muchas gracias. So that was just for
Katia, your Spanish is so awesome. And I know you're winging it, which is even more impressive.
I'm what you call a book. Like, that was all my stuff at Stanford, actually. Cool people. Okay, so this is, thank you so much for this conversation, so necessary. My question is, what ways have you seen mestizos reconnect with their indigenous ancestry in ways that are respectful and mindful of indigenous people's current situations, i.e. commercializing of Dia de los Muertos, cartels, femicide, and COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. That's such a wonderful question, and it's actually going to be another chapter in my book. I'm going to be studying solidarity in the struggle autonomy in Chiran, and how mestizas and mestizos participated in those through vis-a-vis solidarity and that struggle, because I think that that's going to answer some of these questions about, what does it mean then to be a mestizo and want to connect with indigenous communities in a way that is empowering to indigenous communities. And I think that the folks who for example, participated in popularizing Chiran, whether it was, on social media, and or through connections with journalists, who then came to cover stories there, and were on the ground also in Chiran, are very different folks that already went through concientación than, for example, the tourists that I've been talking to in Pátzcuaro, the Mexican tourists, that come there from other parts of Mexico. So I am, going to be digging into the question of solidarity in my book, and hope, to have more answers after I complete the final stage of my field work here in Chiran, or interviewing folks from Chiran.
And next we have, how do you view the transplanting of indigenous groups and their culture and practices from Southern America to areas in North America? How do you see cultural collaborations between Northern USA and Southern indigenous groups on US soils?
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw that very actively happen when I was in the Bay Area, and I became familiar with, like, for example, Three Nations Indian Circle, which is a group of Salvadorian indigenous folks who honor and represent three of the nations that are in El Salvador, the indigenous nations in El Salvador. And the way that they worked, that particular organization, at least when I was there in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, would work with Chicanas and Chicanos, who were also, sort of in these reclamation projects of indigeneity, doing political organizing, as well as with American Indian, organizations. There were collaborations there. For example, I saw a wonderful event on like the International Day of Indigenous People. I forgot exactly what the event was called, where there was representation of political struggles in Latin America alongside representations of political struggles here in the United States. So I see that there, as well as, as an academic, I see this, the potential for this work and the way that it's growing in Native American and Indigenous Studies, which is an organization that both Dr. Baldi and I are a part of. We have the Abi Ayala working group there, and I'm the incoming chair for that particular in that particular position. And we always within the Abi Ayala working group, we always prioritize or try to think about how our panels, for example, that we propose at this huge conference that we hold every year, that they are that they are transcontinental, that they are engaged with with issues also happening in the Pacific Islands. Like I put together one a few years back on cultural appropriation, and it was sponsored by the Abi Ayala working group, but it had two sessions. Two of the panelists were speaking to appropriation in Latin America. We had one person speaking about it in the United States, and then we had another person who was speaking about it in Hawaii. And so that goes to show you, how collaborations like this can happen through intellectual partnerships that emerge in academic societies like NASA. So those are some ways that I've seen it. I also think that a great amount happened at Standing Rock. I think that somebody needs to do field work about it, and get into it. But my particular one of the groups that I have been involved with or supporting over the years is called Orgullo Purépecha, and that they're based out of Washington State, and Orgullo Purépecha is a group of Purépecha migrants, very active, politically minded organizers, and they also wanted to show solidarity with Standing Rock. So we held a fundraiser. I knew that I couldn't go because I had a newborn at the time, so I basically just sent money to support it. But oh no, and I also did the translating of some of the documents that were written, so I did a little bit more than that. And the letter of solidarity that was sent, from the Purépecha Nation Standing Rock. I was able to translate some of that for the group too. But you know, that was beautiful to see. I wasn't there, but it was beautiful to see it, you know, shared on social media, the Purepecha flag, also, you know, having a presence at Standing Rock, and also the letter itself making connections between some of the neoliberal practices that impact and extraction that impact indigenous communities in Mexico, and specifically in Michoacan, and the way that they then see themselves, you know, connected to what was happening in Standing Rock at the time. So I have seen those moments happen, and I've also seen Chicanas and Chicanos you know, participate in those collaborations respectfully as well. And you know, I hope that continues to partake.
Thank you. So we have one more, what it looks like more like a comment in the question and answer, and then I see a question from a student in the chat, and then we'll end it there because I don't want to keep people too long after our stated time. So the first comment is, I don't know if I heard you right, but earlier I think you mentioned how it can be a little tricky exploring your indigeneity, and earlier in my path to connect, I tended to fall in groups that claim to be a platform to learn, but it was mostly filled with sexist men posting pictures of sexualized Mexica women. So.
Yeah, no, that struggle is real. I feel you. It's definitely, you know, something that we still deal with. You know, social media can be so toxic, and there are, you know, these there's still these like warrior societies, quote unquote, you know, that you know, that are based in different places in the US, where that happens. And you know, and so I'm glad that you were able to identify that as a red flag moment, and hopefully you were able to protect yourself, because you know, it's very painful for mestizaje. I think it's very painful for people, you know, who are trying to understand indigeneity, and then have somebody totally take advantage of that vulnerability by, you know, by basically by abusing you. So I encourage, you know, folks to really protect your spirit. You know, you don't want to become more wounded in your path to self-understanding.
And the last question from a student, it says, thank you for meeting with us today and your awesome work. What are some more readings or projects around critical Latinx indigeneities that Dr. Rico suggests we look up today?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm totally you know, willing to send some of those as well, along with the ones that I cited here, to, you know, to Dr. Baldi to share with everybody, so that you can read you know, my colleagues work, and some of my work as well, in critical Latinx indigeneities.
Thank you so much. I would like, I know this is weird with Zoom, right? Like we can't see everybody and everything, but just to really thank Dr. Spears-Rico for her time today, for logging in, for making last minute changes in her life so she could make it happen. It was such a great experience for us, and such a great way to talk about Indigenous Peoples Week on this campus. We are a Hispanic serving institution at Humboldt State, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that our student population, we have a lot of Hispanic students throughout our population. And I think that when we think about all these connections and these stories and histories, it's such an important way that we can see why we do the work that we do. So thank you so much for your work today. And Melita, if you want to end live on Facebook, that would be good.
Thank you all so much.